What if I told you that in 1932, the Australian military deployed machine guns, soldiers, and trucks in a full-scale war against birds and lost badly? Welcome back to Legends of the Past. Today we're diving into one of history's most embarrassing military defeats, the Great Emu War of 1932. This is the true story of how 20,000 flightless birds outsmarted the Australian Army, became an international laughingstock, and proved that sometimes nature fights back. To understand how Australia went to war with birds, we need to go back to post-World War I Australia. The government had promised returning soldiers land grants as compensation for their service. Thousands of veterans were given plots in Western Australia's wheat belt, particularly around the town of Campion. These ex-soldiers turned farmers faced enormous challenges. The land was harsh, the weather unpredictable, and farming was backbreaking work. But they persevered, clearing scrubland and planting thousands of acres of wheat. By 1932, these farmers had successfully established productive wheat farms. The crops were golden and ready for harvest. Everything seemed perfect until the emus arrived. Now, let's talk about emus. These aren't your average birds. Emus are Australia's largest native bird, standing up to 6 feet tall and weighing up to 130 pounds. They're flightless, but they can run up to 30 miles per hour. They're also incredibly destructive when they want to be. Every year, about 20,000 emus would migrate from their breeding grounds in the interior to the coast, following ancient routes that had existed for thousands of years. Unfortunately for the farmers, these migration routes now pass directly through their wheat fields. The emus didn't just eat the wheat. They trampled it, destroyed fences, and left behind massive tracks that made harvesting impossible. A single emu could destroy acres of crops in a day. With 20,000 of them, the farmers were facing complete agricultural devastation. The farmers were desperate. They'd invested everything in these crops, and now giant birds were destroying their livelihoods. They tried everything they could think of: scarecrows, noisemakers, fencing, but nothing worked. The emus just kept coming. In October 1932, the farmers appealed to the government for help. But instead of asking for agricultural assistance or compensation, they made an unusual request. They wanted the military to deploy machine guns to kill the emus. The request eventually reached the desk of Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense. Now, you might expect a government official to laugh off such a ridiculous request. But Pearce saw an opportunity. The military was looking for live-fire training exercises, and this seemed like the perfect chance to give soldiers practice with machine guns while helping farmers. It would be great publicity, the government helping veterans and protecting agriculture. Pearce approved the operation and assigned it to Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. Meredith was given 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission: eliminate the emu threat. The press got wind of the operation and dubbed it the Great Emu War. Newspapers treated it as a joke, but the government was deadly serious. This was an official military operation with real soldiers and real weapons. On November 2, 1932, Major Meredith and his men arrived in Campion, ready for war. They set up their machine guns and prepared to face the enemy. How hard could it be to kill a bunch of flightless birds? The first encounter took place on November 2nd. Meredith's men spotted a group of about 50 emus and set up their machine guns. The plan was simple: wait for the emus to get close, then open fire with devastating effect. But the emus had other ideas. As soon as the first shots were fired, the birds scattered in all directions. Emus, it turned out, had excellent hearing and quick reflexes. They could detect the sound of approaching vehicles from miles away and disappear into the scrubland before the soldiers could get close. The soldiers managed to kill only a few emus in that first engagement. Meredith reported that the birds were extremely cunning and seemed to have developed tactical awareness. Some emus even appeared to post sentries while others fed, creating an early warning system. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. The soldiers would spot a group of emus, set up their machine guns, and open fire. The emus would scatter, and only a handful would be killed. The birds seemed to be learning from each encounter, becoming more cautious and harder to approach. Even worse, the machine guns kept jamming. The harsh outback conditions, dust, heat, and rough handling caused constant mechanical problems. Soldiers spent more time cleaning and repairing their weapons than firing them. After a week of frustrating encounters, Major Meredith decided to change tactics. If the emus were too smart to be ambushed, he would try mobile warfare. The soldiers mounted one of their machine guns on a truck and attempted to chase down the birds. This plan was even more disastrous. The truck couldn't keep up with the emus across rough terrain. The birds could easily outmaneuver a vehicle, darting between trees and rocks where the truck couldn't follow. When the soldiers did get close enough to fire, the bouncing of the truck made accurate shooting impossible. In one particularly embarrassing incident, the truck broke down in the middle of a chase, leaving the soldiers stranded while the emus ran away. In another, the machine gun fell off the truck entirely, leaving the soldiers weaponless and humiliated. The emus seemed to understand that they were being hunted. They began traveling in smaller groups, making them harder to spot. They stayed closer to cover and became more aggressive in their escape tactics. Some birds even appeared to deliberately lead soldiers on wild goose chases, or should I say wild emu chases. Local farmers watched in amazement as professional soldiers with military-grade weapons were consistently outwitted by birds. The emus continued to destroy crops, while the army seemed incapable of stopping them. After 2 weeks of operation, Meredith's men had fired over 2,500 rounds of ammunition and killed fewer than 200 emus. At this rate, they would need 50,000 rounds to kill all the birds, 5 times more ammunition than they had been given. On November 8th, Major Meredith made the difficult decision to withdraw his forces. The operation was clearly failing, and continuing would only lead to more embarrassment. In his official report, he wrote that the emus had displayed a marked ability to conduct guerrilla warfare, and recommended that the operation be suspended. The withdrawal was a humiliating defeat for the Australian military. They had deployed professional soldiers with modern weapons against flightless birds, and lost decisively. The press had a field day, with headlines like "Feathered Foes Too Elusive for Gunners" and "Emus Win the War." But the farmers weren't ready to give up. Their crops were still being destroyed, and they demanded that the government try again. Under pressure from agricultural interests, the government authorized a second operation. On November 13th, Major Meredith and his men returned to the battlefield. This time, they were determined to succeed. They had learned from their mistakes and developed new tactics specifically designed to counter emu guerrilla warfare. The second phase of the war lasted until December 10th. The soldiers tried different approaches: night operations, coordinated attacks, and even attempting to drive the emus into ambush sites. But the results were only marginally better than the first attempt. By the end of December 1932, the Great Emu War was officially over. The final casualty count tells the whole story of this military disaster. The emus had achieved a decisive victory. Of the estimated 20,000 birds, the military had killed fewer than 1,000. The soldiers had fired over 9,000 rounds of ammunition, roughly 10 bullets per dead emu. At that rate, they would have needed 200,000 rounds to eliminate all the birds. The human casualties were limited to wounded pride and damaged reputations. No soldiers were killed or seriously injured, though several suffered minor wounds from equipment malfunctions and vehicle accidents. The real losers were the farmers. Their crops continued to be destroyed throughout the harvest season. Many faced financial ruin as their wheat fields were trampled into worthless stubble. The government eventually provided some compensation, but it was too little, too late. Major Meredith, in his final report, recommended that the emu problem be handled by civilian hunters rather than military forces. He suggested that bounties be paid for dead birds, allowing local farmers to deal with the problem themselves. The government quietly agreed, and the military's involvement in emu control ended forever. It remains the only war in Australian history where the enemy achieved total victory. The Great Emu War became an international sensation and a source of enduring embarrassment for Australia. Newspapers around the world picked up the story, with headlines mocking the Australian military's defeat by flightless birds. British newspapers were particularly cruel, with one writing, "The Australian Army has been defeated by a mob of emus." If this is the quality of their military, perhaps they should stick to sheep farming. American papers joked that Australia needed to declare peace before the emus march on Canberra. The story became a standard joke in international military circles. For decades afterward, Australian officers serving overseas would be asked about the Emu War by their foreign counterparts. The defeat became part of Australian military folklore, though not the kind anyone wanted to be remembered for. Domestically, the war highlighted the disconnect between government policy and practical realities. Politicians in distant cities had approved a military operation without understanding the challenges involved. The farmers had needed help, but military force was clearly the wrong solution. The incident also demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of Australian wildlife. Emus had evolved over millions of years to survive in harsh conditions, and they weren't about to be intimidated by a few soldiers with machine guns. Today, emu populations in Australia are actually protected by law. The birds that were once considered agricultural pests are now recognized as an important part of the ecosystem. Modern farmers use different methods to protect their crops: fencing, population management, and crop rotation, rather than military force. The Great Emu War has become part of Australian popular culture, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a musical. It's remembered with humor rather than shame, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful military in the world can be defeated by something as simple as a bird that runs really fast. So the next time you hear about a military operation, remember the Great Emu War. Sometimes the enemy isn't what you expect, and sometimes the best strategy is to admit defeat and try a completely different approach. And if you're ever in Australia and see an emu, show some respect. You're looking at a veteran of the only war where birds achieved total victory over a modern army. What do you think? Are there any other examples of military operations that went hilariously wrong? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more absurd stories from history.